Hello everyone, I am Namigata Tsuyoshi from Kyushu University, Japan. We'll have 3 presentations in our panel. So before the presentation, I want to introduce the panelists briefly. The first panelist is me, Namigata. I am a professor of Kyushu University, now teaches Japanese literature and comparative literature at the Graduate School of Integrated Sciences for Global Society. And I am the author of book Actaga Prize published in 2005. And now I'm researching about the modernism and the exoticism from 1930 to 1940. And recently published the paper about Hayashi Fumiko's Ukigumo and the post-war Horoki in this year. And the second presenter is Isabelle Labelle, right? She is assistant professor in Japanese literature at the College of Humanities and Sciences, Nihon University, Tokyo. After studying French literature at Paris Sorbonne University, she earned a PhD in Japanese studies from Paris Diderot University in 2016. As a mixed scholar in Tokyo, she earned a PhD in communication studies from Waseda University 2 years later. She was assistant professor non-tenure in Japanese literature at the School of International Liberal Studies, Waseda University, before joining Nihon University in April 2020. She teaches Japanese literature in English with a focus on translation, transcultural exchanges, and world literature. As a researcher, she focused on the reception, integration, and transformation of European texts into Japanese literature from Meiji to early Showa. She published many articles and translated modernity world literature in Japan and Han Kindaitek Japanism and so on. She has a lots of lists, but briefly I introduced. Sorry. And the third presenter is Marco Tadel. He is researcher fellow at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature's Culture of the University of Bergamo, where he teaches Japanese language with a focus on translation and academic purposes. He earned a PhD in Japanese studies from Roma La Sapienza University in 2017. As a researcher, he focused on the analysis of Natsume Soseki, the series short pieces. Together with professor Andrea Morizzi, he published the Italian translation of Yokyoshu, and he is currently working on the translation and commentary of Mankan Tokoro Dokoro. He published his essay, Soseki's Shosai Monogatari, Tales Told from One Study, where he examined the self-presentation of the author within his studio. I'm sorry, my son is here. ちょっと待って。スマホ。わかった。Excuse me. In this panel,
inclusive, so should be okay. Thank you very much. Say hello to your son.
And each presentation will be in 20 minutes in length. And after 3 presentations, we have the Q&A session. So please give your question to the chat of Zoom. Okay. So let's start. The first presentation is me. My presentation title is Primitive Voices, Modernism, Regionalism, and Exoticism, Japanese Literature in 1930s. Let me start to read my manuscript. is the contents today. As Sage Lipit once argued at the beginning of his book, Topographies of Japanese Modernism, Kobayashi Hideo's critic, Literature of the Lost Home, occupies a critical position when considering Japanese modernist literature. Lipit reads from the critic that Japan was losing its Japanese tradition as a basis for thought through modernization, and that the urban reconstruction of Tokyo after the Great Kanto earthquake brought about the connection with the past and the common feeling of anxiety within the people. Japanese artists who lost their ideological tradition began to depict the dismantling of the ego through the style of modernism. Furthermore, using the modernization of the city of Tokyo as a setting, they have come to concentrate on depicting the alienated self. Through the works of Actaga Ryunosuke, Yokomitsu Riichi, Kawabata Yasunari, and Hayashi Fumiko, Lipit's book successfully mapped the features of Japanese modernism, such as destruction of the ego, the alienation of the subject in space, and the destruction of the genre itself. Destruction of the ego and the feeling of anxiety is also related to wartime nationalism, as represented by Yokomitsu Riichi. It provides a practical perspective for analyzing the broad historical context covering the 1920s and 1930s. What I would like to focus on this time, however, is the significance of Kobayashi's critique in a more limited historical context. Concerning Kobayashi's point about feeling closer to the Moroccan deserts than the scenery of Ginza, Lipit pointed out the atmosphere of Japanese culture in 1930s to break with Japanese tradition and become familiar with the Western tradition. In other words, Ginza and Morocco here are symbols of Japan and foreign countries, and of course, I agree with this opinion. But as Lipit himself explains, Morocco is a colony in North Africa, so we can read the relationship between Ginza and Morocco as the imperial capital and the colony. Thinking Morocco as a colony is interesting because it coincides with the time when the new modernists who emerged with the rise of new art school, Shinko Geijutsu, were paying attention to the colonies and beginning to pursue the possibility of literature in Korea and Taiwan as one of the region in Japan. The focus on the region has been understood as a central issue among the Japan Romantic school, Nihon Romanha, but it has also become an important issue for modernists. Kobayashi Hideo's fascination with the distant land and past and his reference to the Morocco and Chambara film may seem to be on a different level. Still, in fact, they imply that literary figure of the mid-1930s, the era of literary revival, Bunge Fukko, were united by the common world region. These trends, which can be said to have differentiated into colonialism and nationalism, have a very similar character when viewed from exoticism, based on the longing for and beautification of the primitive. The former is about listening to the voice of inner wild and longing for spatially distant places, while the latter is about going back in time to emphasize with our ancient ancestors and listen to their voices. The purpose of this paper is to reconsider, through the voices of comparatively minor modernists, the situation of Japanese literature in the era of emergency after the Manchurian incident and the suppression of Puritan literature. The magazine Kodo Action I focus on this presentation was published since 1933 to 1935. It was one of the leading magazines in the movement of literary revival, as well as the magazine Bungakukai and Bungei. In this magazine, modernism was discussed very often. Like those articles, among the various articles on modernist literature, the one that stands out is Abe Tomoji's The Possibility of Modernism. Abe begins by identifying the weakness of the new art school, which became the representative of modernism. The reason why the new art school was attacked was its frivolity. In response to Abe's critique, which analyzes modernist literature from the inside of the work and searches for possibilities, Haruyama Yukio, who was also known as a major intellectual like Abe, focused on the prominence of the novel depicting rural areas in his article, The Theory of New Regionalist Novel, and sees in them the possibility of new realism. He dared to name it New Regionalism to emphasize the newness that emerged after modernism and Puritan literature. Haruyama makes a distinction between regional novel and the regionalist novel, saying that the former depict the people and things of each region as a strange curiosity. At the same time, the latter is written from trying to defend one's ground. These two views are based on the differences between provincialism and regionalism in French literature. Inuta Shigeru's article Problem Regionalist Literature deal with regionalism in slightly different way than Haruyama. In Inuta's case, he wrote from the standpoint of peasant literature, and he used local art in Germany as his source. In his analysis, he said that in Germany, the theme of country and its people were reaction to the urbanism of France. In any case, it is worth noting that the emphasis on the countryside region is considered as an extension of modernism. Related to this point, it is important that in 1935, the magazine Code published a special issue entitled Japanese Exoticism. There were two articles. The first was Life of Taial, and the second was Culture Aspect of the Ainu. Oshika Taku writes about the Taial, the savage of Taiwan, in an attempt to understand them from their perspective. The fact that they are barbaric is not something we civilized people should feel ashamed of, nor is there any reason why we should teach them to be ashamed of it. This provides a reference to the Musha incident, which could be taken as an implicit criticism to Japanese colonial policy. Considering that they were looking at regional novel and regionalist novel, as Haruyama put it, the latter is what Oshika was advocating. Under the framework of exoticism, he discussed the issue of protecting Taiwan and aiming at the Taiwanese localism. In response to the criticism that they were frivolous, the modernists manifested their desire for the primitive through local and even colonial literature. Oshika Taku, to whom the modernists turned their attention, is a fascinating figure. He is younger brother of the poet Kaneko Mitsuharu. His literary career began in the mid-1920s, and his novel, The Savage Yabanjing, was selected for the Chuo Koron Prize in 1935. It was based on the Saramao incident of 1920s. The novel is said to depict the savagery of the Aborigines, while at the same time strongly criticizing the savagery of the mountain police officers and the governor's general rival policy. The main character, Tazawa, is a newly appointed police officer who has been assigned to a local police station in Taiwan. While he was engaged in the subjugation activities in the field, he eventually cuts the Aboriginal's head and awakened to the wild. And then Tazawa raped an Aboriginal girl, Taimorika, and made her his wife, becoming natives and living together. Tazawa's wife, Taimorika, wears white powder and clothes similar to those of her Japanese husband in order to match him. In other words, she is portrayed as the daughter of an aborigine who is being enlightened by the civilization. Sometimes Tazawa laments the lack of wildness in such timorical characters, but rather he feels a sense of mission to revive the wildness that dwells in the daughter of semi-civilized aborigine. When considering modernist literature in Japan in mid-1930s, the issue of return to Japan has been more central to the discussion than colonialism. However, Kawato Yasunori's No Country Yukiguni, which began serialization in 1935, is also a regional literature set in Echigo Yuzawa. Like Oshika's The Savage, No Country is a very similar story in that it is about a stately man who goes to the countryside, finds the wildness of the local women attractive, and fall into love with them. In this sense, Snow Country can be reconsidered as a case of modernist literature. The appeal of wildness in Oshika's Savage and Kawata's Snow Country has something in common with the unreasonable appeal that Kobayashi Hideo felt toward the Chambara film and the film Morocco. In other words, it is an interest in the primitive and the commonality as exoticism. In this way, the return to Japan in the literature of mid-1930s can be understood as an experiment of the old modernist Shinkankaku, which is also connected to the phenomenon seen in the modernist literature after the New Art School Shinko Geijutsu. Getting back to Kobayashi's critique, the episode of mountain climbing, which is presented as extreme example of speed without the homeland, is also worth considering. When he points out that to go off for inspiration to the beauty of nature may seem to be perfectly natural activity, but on the reflection we must admit that it is just another manifestation of our quotidian intellectual unease. He may suggest his criticism to the trend of seeking for the wild, the primitive. If we can say that the new art school are the new modernists and the new sensibility Shinkankaku are the old modernists, the former focused on the colonial region, the latter saw potential in the region connected to Japan's past. This view is possible, but to be more precise, the old modernists were restraining two new modern movements, modernism, which was emerging as an activist movement, Kodo Shugi, and the Japan Romantic School, Rinhon Romanha, which was becoming a driving force in return to tradition. Yokomichi's critique, The Theory of Pure Novel, was published in April 1935. The main focus of this essay was on the definition of the pure novel as both pure and literature and popular fiction, and the question of what the fourth person is. However, it is also important to pay attention to the way he reveals how he is trying to distance himself between activism and romanticism in the year 1935. In his critique, Haruyama distinguished between regional novel and regionalist novel and pointed out the latter's attitude to trying to protect their homeland. This is precisely the idea of localism. The Japan Romantic School, Yasuda Yojiro, responded to the Kobayashi's critique, his article, Literature of the Lost Land, explaining that literature of the lost home need to pursue literature rooted in the land. In this way, the so-called Bunge Fukko of the mid-1930s has in common with modernism and the Japan Romantic School in that it focused on the literature of the local area and the hometown. In contrast to this trend, which focused on land and space, Yokomichi's pure novel focused on psychological issues, including self-consciousness. On top of that, he marks an abrupt reference to the problem of Asia and ethnicity. What does the reference to Asian ethnicity means to Yokomitsu? The answer to this question is not provided in this critique. Rather, it appears in the traveler's trip to Europe in 1936 to cover the Berlin Olympics and his novel Melancholic Journey, Yoshu, which was written based on his experience. His reference to the marathon runner Song Gi-jun and the episode surrounding their transportation of the film of the marathon event are essential points in examining his view on the colonies. However, in terms of the overall volume, they are very few. Instead, the same issue has been discussed extensively by Abe Tomoji in his Korean Youth in Winner in Fuyu no Yado, also published in 1936, and his novel Beijing, published in 1937, based on his stay in Beijing in 1935. By returning to the historical context in the mid-1930s, it becomes possible to consider both Kawabata's Snow Country and Yokomi's Melancholic Journey as issues of modernist literature rather than significant works that continue through the wartime. It has become common sense to conclude modernist literature of the wartime period with nationalism, but is that the only answer? Is there anything else we can from the consequences of modernist literature? From this perspective, I believe that the breakthrough can be made by looking at the modernism as colonial literature. Another position that pursued the primitive. By understanding the relationship between the two sides of coin, we can begin to think Japanese modernism alternatively. Thank you for listening. Oh, thank you. 時間守ったよね。
バッチリでした。
So let's move on to second presentation, third presentation, and after three presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, okay? The second presenter is Isabella. So please start your presentation after, yes, we can look your screen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. And I am extremely lucky to be presenting after Professor Namigata because I'm talking about exactly the same cultural and literary context here, the mid-1930s especially. And I find this idea of finding a place from where to write. So metaphorically speaking, but also very concretely speaking, finding a land, a place from where to write is a theme that's endlessly interesting and effective in order to look at the literature of this era. And here, I suppose that in this presentation, I'd like to talk about gender and gender performance as such a place, actually a different place from where male authors can write in this time of extreme crisis and a moment when the power forces and the power relationships within the literary world are fundamentally changing. So I'm also happy about to hear that from the previous presentation that already we're talking about the same thing, the Bunge Fukko and the Nihon Romaha. So I hope it will add a little bit of something on this theme. I'm talking about these two authors mainly today. So Kawabata that we just heard about, Snow Country, and a young Dazai. So they are roughly the same generation. Kawabata is a little bit older and a little bit more established when Dazai appears on the literary scene in the mid-1930s. So I'm focusing today on these texts by Dazai Osamu, written in what's called usually Josei Dokuhakutai female monologic style or Josei Kokuhakutai female confessional style that have greatly contributed to creating the fame of Dazai Osamu and his popularity up to this day. And we can see here the his very first text written in this style appears in 1937. And then his very successful, the first very successful one is Joseto, Schoolgirl, in 1939. So the moment when the Bunge Fuku has happened and where this literary world has been reorganized around new ideas. So before I go into this, actually, I just want to have a quick overview of what we're talking about here when we're talking about these texts written in a female style. What do we mean by female language? Many scholars in Japan and abroad have pointed to the fact that here we are mostly talking about a performance of gender, which is more normative than descriptive, right? For a very long time, onna kotoba was considered mostly as how women actually talk, but today, led by someone like Nakamura Momoko and other linguist scholars in linguistics, we can see that it's more about how people think at a certain time, at a certain place, that women should talk. So it's more of a normative approach than descriptive approach. This is why many scholars here call this kind of style as Joso Buntai rather than Jose Kotoba or Onna Kotoba. Joso Buntai, that can be translated as female drag, writing in a deliberate gender performance. And here, for instance, in this article that is quoted here by Sekireiko, we have this description, this definition as normative feminine expressions created by male writers to represent femaleness. And I want to emphasize the fact that this applies to both female and male writers, right? So female writers too, who I'm not talking about today, have to perform femaleness in order to be accepted and recognized as female writers in a literary world, obviously mostly dominated by male writers. So there's this idea in Japanese literature from the Meiji era onward of gender as a performance that is not necessarily performed the best by women themselves, right? But women too have to find their voice and be recognized as female. So there's a very deep and complex question here that is not going to be answered today, whether these texts, especially by Dazai, but these texts written by male that borrow the voice of women, whether they are giving them a voice, so voicing a woman's concern and a woman's perspective in a male-dominated world, or is it are there texts that confiscate the voice of women, take away the voice of women from women, in an attempt to silence them further? So this is it could be either or both, right? I have an article coming up that looks into this a little bit further, but of course, Joseto and Shayo especially are problematic on many levels from an ethical perspective, as we know that they are mostly written from texts written by women who are not acknowledged as authors, especially in the case of Shayo today. Many scholars think that it should be considered as co-authored by the female writer whose Dazai used the text to write it, right? So that's an important point to notice here. Also, I wanted to say one thing about this text. You see here the publishing outlets. They are really mixed. They're not only for women readers at all. Some of them, Wakakusa, Fujingaho, Shoujo no Tomo, etc., are for female readership, but others, Shincho, Bungakukai, are for general readership, and especially people interested in literature. So this moment here that these texts start to appear and become prominent, this text written from a female perspective, is, as the previous presentation has looked at, a very specific time within the literary world. It's a moment when a moment of crisis that could be symbolized by Actaga's suicide, and of course, the invasion of Manchuria and the rise of a militaristic ideology in Japan. And this, the violent suppression of the proletarian literature creates a vacuum that needs to be filled by new figures, new people, new journals, new publishing outlets, such as Bungakukai or Nihon Romanha. So Dazai starts his career within this context, and one of his very first successful novel, Doki no Hana, Flowers of Buffoonery will be published in Nihon Romanha, which is not ultra-nationalistic from the get-go, right? At the very beginning, it's not necessarily marked at the far right, and it will progressively evolve toward that direction. So we can hear that these two prizes created in 1935, Actaga Prize and Naoki Prize, are going to also change the power relationship within the literary world for durably up to this day by establishing this distinction, Junbungaku, Taishu Bungaku. And Dazai Osamu becomes famous actually by failing this first failing to get the first Actaga Prize. This is a very famous episode that has really cemented his personal legend and his persona as a writer. So this is an interesting moment because it could also be seen at a very elaborate PR operation by Kikuchi-kan and the people of the Bungei Shunju who create the prize, and in order to promote it and to give it a visibility, will orchestrate this rivalry between Kawabata, who is a member of the jury, and Dazai, who fails to get the Actaga Prize. As a big fan of Actagawa, he says publicly that he's absolutely in agony for losing the prize, and he will publish an open letter to Kawabata in which he threatens to murder him. This is a very famous episode that is still really well remembered today. What's interesting in this letter, this is again an open letter published by Bungei Tsushin, which is also a media owned by Kikuchi-kan and the people of the Bungei Shunju. So we can see here also the logic behind publishing this letter. It's an open public letter, so it could be looked at as part of his work, of Dadai's literary work. And you can see here in this letter two versions of masculinity in crisis, in competition here. On the one hand, you have Dazai, who is enacting this masculinity gone awry, this histrionic aggressivity that no one takes seriously. His buffoonery, doke, is it's a key word in his persona at the time. This typical decadent, nihilistic, unadapted writer. On the other hand, he criticizes Kawabata for his sophistication, coldness, for his effeminate aestheticism. This famous sentence, right? Kotori o kai buto o miru no ga sonna ni rippa na circus nano ka. This is pointing towards Kawabata's self-portrait within his novel Of Birds and Beasts, published in 1933. So here, these two versions of masculinity that both are somehow displaced, somehow do not fit within the main model proposed at the day of the strong stoic male who is devoted to his duty and his country. Linked to this, we have at the same time, a couple of years later, so this is 1935, and then from 1937, 39, you have this all this text written by women, but also by men in a female style that will take center stage in the Japanese literary world. It starts with one of Kawabata's texts, Jojoka, but many others. So we have also this key role played by Kawabata as a editor member of Fujin Koron, this very popular magazine addressed to a female readership, where he encourages readers, so female readers, to write and to send their writing to the magazine to be published. And these articles are very interesting because they do really express this normative approach to how gender should be performed and expressed, and here through a male perspective. Is Kawabata explaining that he's expecting text revealing women's innocence and grace, their purity and nobility. And there's also this idea that women who are traditionally not the expected gender for writers write in a more spontaneous, less sophisticated, and therefore more truthful way. And this idea of the truthfulness and the authenticity is obviously key and center to this whole Shisho Setsu tradition that Kawabata and Dazai are elaborated on and deeply changing at the time, renovating at the time. So Dazai's Joseto comes the year after the surprise success of this text written by an actual young girl, Toida Masako, called Tsusurikata Kyoshitsu, which had been greatly praised by Kawabata as a place where you can see the source of literature's native place. So we have here a common theme with the previous presentation about finding the source, finding the origin, the native land of an authentic voice. And young girl, untouched by civilization, by corruption, could be such a place in the imagination of these writers. So many scholars have pointed out that Joseto by Dazai could be an answer to Kawabata to show him continuing their rivalry through this publishing text, showing that he can do what Kawabata expects from this gender performance of young femaleness, of girlhood, very well. And actually Kawabata has praised Joseto as a masterpiece when it was published in 1939. So here, I think this is the main point that I'd like to explore in this presentation, and it should be looked at much more closely, comparing this normative text about what female discourse should be and the actual text written by these male authors at the time. But we could look at Girlhood, this young, immature version of femaleness, as this dreamed, fantasized place of authenticity, of purity. When within a context where these competing masculinities that played this very important role in building the modern nation states from the Meiji area become less and less diverse and leave less and less space for a discursive regime for male to explore diverse ways of being male writers and expressing themselves in a diverse way. So many scholars have also noted that writing through a young girl's perspective was also a way for such writers such as Dazai and Kawabata to escape censorship, escape also direct responsibility. They weren't voicing directly their own issues as intellectual or male writers. It's a way to explore something else, a displaced locus, for there to continue their self-revelation, their confessional style that they had previously practiced, but from a little bit of a displaced angle. So here I have a quotation from Schoolgirl, a very famous one at the beginning of the text, where you have this whole passage about the glasses. And I think this exemplifies what I'm trying to look at here, this idea of escape, trying something, a space that is within the society, but not within this militaristic male model that is more and more imposed on men in the 1930s as nationalism and militarism become more and more important in Japan. You have this idea that as a girl, this young narrator is very aware of what society expects from her, but she can use that to escape within a world where things are more intense, the colors are more lively, things are more colorful, a beautiful dreamlike reality that is asked from her, but that is also a place for her to escape to in order to not face the dark, violent, aggressive society she lives in. So we can see here when she takes off her glasses, she says that everyone looks cheerful, people look much more friendly, and that during this time, she can believe that she fits within this gender role asked of her, of the nice young miss. She can believe that she is this person that is perfectly at ease, at home within the society as a young girl. But of course, throughout this text, you have this deep awareness that she is not really there. She is not really where she should be. She is trying to perform this role of the nice young miss, but not always feeling at home there. She is internally displaced within herself. She doesn't feel at home in this gender role, but she also uses it to make the world around her more beautiful and to find beauty and joy. You can see here that she's very conflicted about this idea of the glasses as a way to escape her reality, but also something that is cutting her off from the world, something that is not allowing her to express who she really is, her emotions, and that narrows the possibility of her communication. So I think I can stop here, and I hope to discuss a little bit more with all of you this idea of gender here and gender performance also as a place, a metaphorical place to discuss, to express in a distorted way the crisis and the tensions that are rising during the mid-1930s, especially for male authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Isabel. And thank you for keeping time. And we have to move on to the third presentation. After that, we have a question time. So third presenter is Marco Tadelli. So please share the screen and start your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Namigata Sensei. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm happy to be the third one in this panel, actually, because it's very interesting. You were both talking about finding a metaphorical place where to write, and now I'm moving to find a physical place where to write. So it could be like the red, the fil rouge that leads the three presentation. So okay, today I'm gonna I would like to present you the result of what is an ongoing research on how the studio, the shosai in Japanese, strongly associated with a male writer in modern Japanese literature from 1920s, gradually became a less male gendered space with the emergence of professional writers, women writers like Miyamoto Yuriko and Hayashi Fumiko. The premise is that the literary self-representation of women writers within their studio space contributed to challenge spatial gender discriminations, and it was one of the means to engage and transform the way women, and more specifically women writers, were perceived in the literary world and in society at large. Now, in the Meiji period, the word shosai was currently used to indicate, as many of you might know, the studio, a room usually equipped with desk, personalized stationery, a collection of books, and a bookshelf to store them. And it was mainly set up in the upper class houses and reflected the new eclectic trends of domestic architecture that integrated Japanese and Western features. The studio was situated immediately off the main entrance hall and was usually a Western style room where the head of the family could receive guests in private, conduct business, or even study. Since the organization of roles and activities shaped domestic space and reflected socioeconomic differences between men and women, the kitchen was, of course, considered a female gendered room, while the studio was a masculine place. Here the husband could enjoy some time on his own, keeping the door closed, and to avoid intrusions of other family members. If the head of the household was an intellectual, a critic, or a writer, then the studio was mainly used as a workplace and sometimes called by evocative names like, in case of Soseki, was Sambo, the mountain retreat. And sobriquets like this were probably inspired by a long-standing tradition, both in Japanese literature and iconography that runs throughout the pre-modern and the classical Japanese literature and dates back to the Song Dynasty in China, when the literary studio became both an object of visual and literary representation and the medium through which the literatus could represent himself. Also, for Meiji Japan's writers, the studio is often the only place where they can feel at ease and their uncertainties can be minimized. It's a small, closed world of their own where they can carry out artistic experiments and live according to their ideas, unhampered by old conventions and also utilitarian concerns. As Lipid says, although they suffered from their isolation from society, the studio enabled them to pursue and adopt the most radical and avant-garde ideas in the world. So given the importance of the studio as a display of a writer's self-identity and creativity, it is not surprising that many modern Japanese novelists choose to represent themselves as writers in their private and intimate workplaces. Probably the most noteworthy example is Soseki Shoin production, because a common feature of this semi-autobiographical bulk of writings is the presence of an ironic and self-deprecatory narrator in his studio, cluttered with books, papers, pens, and pencils. We see him at work, pressed to meet a deadline, interrupted by visits, reflecting upon whatever comes to his mind, or trying to warm up over a brazier in a winter day. So his literary persona is in a way is a prototype of a 20th century artist as a solitary man fully absorbed in his thoughts, who enjoys reading and writing above all anything else. So literary convention, fictional and autobiographical works, popular male authors' interviews, and photographs of writer at their desk in literary magazines contributed to significantly to strengthen the image of the studio as a male gender space throughout the Meiji era and in the following decades. This was also the reflection of the predominant unequal distributions of roles and rights between women and men, and a result of a reduced women access to socially valued knowledge and to the literary world. Even just a quick scrutiny of women's writing of the same period shows the lack of women writers' self-representation in their studio in fictional or autobiographical works. And this is not surprising because if on one hand, women writers began to publish at the end of the 19th century and were received enthusiastically in some literary circles, on the other hand, critically acclaimed women writers were regarded suspiciously and generally treated as exceptions, because women's writing was acceptable as long as it was considered a hobby or a leisure activity carried out in a corner of the kitchen or the bedroom. And in this respect, there are strong analogies with the condition of English women writers of the early 19th century, as described by Virginia Woolf. She says, if a woman wrote, she would have to write in the common sitting room. She says this, recalling the case of Jane Austen, who had no studio and wrote in the living room, making sure that neither the servants nor the visitors would notice that. So Japanese women could never be serious writer and devoted mothers and wife, and writing as a primary occupation was to be a male activity. Because I don't have enough time, I'll give you just one example from an early 20th century novel that demonstrate how strong the male connotation of the studio was in women writings as well. This is the case of The Vow, Seigon by Tamura Toshiko. Edward Fowler describes her as a feminist author, renegade lover, and a prototypical dangerous woman, being neither a good wife nor a wise mother. And The Vow is the story of a married couple, as you know, who decide to divorce after a violent quarrel triggered by futile reasons. And Seiko, the main character, is a woman who has enough confidence in her physical and emotional identity not to prostrate herself before her husband. However, for a moment, she pictures herself kindly begging him to retract his intention to divorce, and while he's out, she steps in his studio for the last time. And this is what she says: "I stepped into his studio, seized by the desire to be in his room. I pulled open the drawer to his writing desk, traced my hand along his bookshelves, and clasped to my breast his beloved figurine cast in the image of Salambo. Then I leaned up against the desk and I imagined myself in his embrace. Still, he did not come home." So here the studio space clearly becomes a sort of a substitute of the man himself. Holding his husband's belongings and leaning up against his desk, Seiko recalls for the last time the warmth of his embrace when they were newly married and in love. Now, despite the disparagement of women writers by Meiji society, the growth of women's literary scene in the following decades, the emergence of newspapers targeting female readers, and the growth also of urban wage-earning women contributed to accelerate the pace of social change and to empower women writers' voice. And the blurring of gender norms escalating during the first decades of the 20th century and fuel the image of a new woman. Independent, self-sufficient, self-confident young working women shattered conventional gender roles. And it was in this second decade of the 20th century, so during the Taisho period, that women started to argue that a wife too should have a place of her own and that a studio was naturally desirable for a female writer. There are many examples. I'll just give you a couple. The first one is the novelist and social activist Miyamoto Yuriko, also known for her involvement in proletarian and women's liberation movements. She was among the Jutaku's contributors. Jutaku was a journal, a magazine edited by the Jutaku Kairyokai, the Housing Reform Association. In her Shosai o Chishin ni Shitaie, house centered on the studio, published in the September 1922 issue of Jutaku, she describes the ideal house she and her husband, both writers, would like to live in. She presents herself as a professional writer who makes a living out of her writing in the very same way her husband does, and thus imagining a house equipped with 2 studios suited to their needs. Again, in Shosai no Joken, my studio's requirements, the following here, she clearly states what her studio should be like. I will list the requirements of the studio as I pictured in my imagination. So it should be quiet, sunlight should enter in the room, windows are large, and to prevent humidity and fire, it is in Western style, and the furniture as a soothing color. So the floor, this is very important, is not squeaky, not to disturb the concentration. It's interesting to know that Miyamoto Yuriko is not only describes her ideal studio, but also represents herself within her own one, because in another piece called Tsuyoku, Reminiscences, appeared in the 1981 complete edition of her works. While spending a humid summer day in the loneliness of her studio, she recalls the death of her beloved uncle, who used to retreat in the same room. So the studio becomes here a sort of physical correlative of her interiority, and the memories related to this space strengthen the relationship between uncle and niece even after the former's death. A second example I'd like to give you is the Hayashi Fumiko Seikatsu. Here, Seikatsu is a short account of her life written in 1935, and where she touches different topics. Her struggles to find writing inspiration, her being a nocturnal writer, her love for flowers, painting, and travels, and her mostly male friendship, scornful reviews of her novels, and even interactions with the tax inspector. And the description of her existence is a mixture of anecdotes, entries from a diary she had kept 3 years before, introspections, and also bits of wisdom. And she also talks at length about her studio on the first floor and her activities there. The studio for her is almost like a sanctuary where she can immerse in reading and writing while her maid and her husband are asleep. And of course, being an account of her life in a literary fashion, some details might be fictional. Nonetheless, the description of a space arranged to fit her needs as a writer pursuing a career undoubtedly challenge gender boundaries and gender's spatial arrangements within the household. The studio, and not the kitchen, is the room where she spent her most valuable time. And here is a short extract from Seikatsu. She says, when I go upstairs to the studio on the first floor with 3 evening papers in my hand, the fire in the brazier is dying down. I add some charcoal, place an iron kettle over it, and while the water heats up, I look at the 3 evening edition. Then she describes the reading of newspaper. Then the minute I finish my newspaper reading, the water begins to boil. This moment is like heaven to me. I breathe on my glasses and I clean to the round lenses with tanned leather. Then I pour some tea and I touch various things on the desk. I feel like asking them, are you okay? The pen I use is a fountain pen and the ink is Maruzen Athena ink. In front of the writing paper, I place a small mirror, and sometimes I amuse myself sticking out my tongue or spinning my eyes around. But when I start writing long things, this mirror bothers me, so I end up throwing it on the bed. When I'm writing, the thing I hate most is to look up in a word in the dictionary. And hopelessly staying on it forever. My dictionary is one of those for students self-study, and I bought it for 75 cents when I was wandering around Takamatsu in Shikoku, and it is already read. No matter how many times I buy a dictionary, this one is handy after all, so I keep using it even though it doesn't have enough words. Really, when I think about it, my life looks like that of a schoolgirl in the countryside, but when I was asked to write something about my life, although my present one is not impressive, I start to feel that there is something noteworthy in it. Now, to better understand the relevance of this quoted passage, it is perhaps worth remembering that at the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers like Asahi were publishing interviews, a series like Bunshin no Seikatsu, writer's lifestyle, on the life of famous writers such as Soseki Kafu, and to satisfy readers' curiosity, they were interviewed about their income, hobbies, likes and dislikes, and also, of course, the studio's arrangement and writing habits. The focus was upon the writers, with no mention of marriage or family matters, and needless to say, only male writers were interviewed in this phase. Therefore, this seemingly unimportant descriptions of Hayashi Fumiko lifestyle has, on the contrary, a deep significance because no matter what kind of writer people think she is, Hayashi presents herself as a poet and a novelist who has a dedicated writing space. She wants to be considered a professional writer above all, and entering the studio late at night becomes part of a ritual that can put her mind in the right headspace for productive writing practices. Also, we could say that in a materialistic sense, the private studio is a status symbol. It states that she can make a living publishing poetry and fiction and can afford to have such a place in a home. So in conclusion, we could say that due to the reciprocity between status and space, the studio as a male gender room was a reflection of a mainstream culture and socially acknowledged differences between men and women in modern Japan. Then changes of ideas about the role of women within the family and the society also affected spatial arrangements, and this transformation contributed to consolidate new pattern of behaviors. Articles in which women writers openly professed their desire for a room of their own and descriptions of their writing habits in a studio, such as Hayashi Fumiko Seikatsu, concurred to reconstruct the image of the writer and the studio in a more gender neutral way. This change in spatial arrangement and representation might seem probably irrelevant, but it's worth remembering that space arrangements typically fall into the category of the things we do not think about. And probably for this reason, they have a great power. They have the ability to sustain the status quo without encountering any kind of resistance. And I think I should stop here because the time is. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to your questions if you have any.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Marco, and thank you for your keeping time. And now we are going to move on to the Q&A session, but I cannot find any question in chat of Zoom now. So if you have any question, please. Oh, okay. Now, I find the question now. From Kana Matsueda. Isabel, Marco, can read the question now?
I can read the question.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Marco, thank you.
Thank you so much for all your thought-provoking presentations. From all the three presentations, I understood that the Japanese young novelist in 1930s, both male and female novelists, tried to go beyond the norms Japanese literature before that. I would like to ask you all, what do you think about the impacts Japanese novelists who sought transboundary and periphery of literature gave to Japanese literature in and after 1930s? I hope I read it. Okay.
It's very good and very difficult question. Isabel, can you answer this question?
Yes, so I cannot, of course, answer all of it, but I guess what's very interesting about this time, the 1930s, is that the whole space gets narrower, right? If we follow the image, it gets narrow because there's censorship, there's very strong propaganda, there's very strong control of the state over what's being published, over the media. So therefore, there's less room for authors to find a space, a freedom of to choose freely the space where they want to talk from, I feel. And that's why it gets really interesting, because writers, male and female, in many different ways, find this very narrow spaces to go around to create a periphery that is not really condoned by the main society and the government. And therefore they have to develop all kinds of tactics and discursive strategies in order to still be saying things that they should not necessarily be saying. So I feel that this way of being both within the society and complying with the rules, while at the same time subverting them, is something that you see before and after, but is especially strong during this time because of the political circumstances. So that's why it's kind of, it crystallizes a lot of issues that are representative of Japanese literature before and after, but that are expressed really well in this period.
Thank you. And how about Marco?
Well, I would like just to add to what Isabel perfectly expressed. Again, it's the 30s are a very particular period in the story of history of Japan, and the search of freedom is not only metaphorical again, but is also something physical, especially for women. It was necessary to first of all to find a space, a mental space, also to write. So I think that what they the example, what they teach to the following generation is that, you know, even women have the right to have a place for their own, where to write, where to create, and where to put their creativity and to perform in the best way. So I think this is from my perspective what I can say about this.
I think from, sorry to interrupt, Marco and Isabella's account for this about this kind of impact to answer the question is really helpful to think about where in a limited space, as Isabella mentioned, that where the writers in this particular period get an inspiration. One could be appropriating the female voice, could be going to find the authenticity from the primitiveness, and also kind of claiming kind of space for in order to write. And I'm not trying to forcefully connect these three papers, but I think something to resonate that. Also, Cecile Sensei has asked a question to Kamigata Sensei about the, I don't know if I can read the question to the floor, but I think in order for Kamigata Sensei to answer the question, I think it's better for me to read it. So her question is, the term wild or wildness in the English version correspond to which word in Kawabata's Yukiguni?
In Japanese, yasei. I'm writing in the chat.
You can answer it with the microphone.
And in North Country, Snow Country, the discretion of Komako その孤独を哀愁を踏み破って野生の威力を
Namigata-san, I think you're muted.
Yeah. 野生の威力を宿していた.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Sorry. How about also use the word yasei in the same word as Yabanjing in Oscar Taku's short novel?
I think it's easier if Isabel can use the microphone and ask directly to Marcos.
Yes, thank you. I think so too. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, thank you for your presentation, Marco. I was really struck by this desire from these female writers to have a room of their own and how important it is. And it seems to be really a universal concern. So what about this text by Virginia Woolf, which be the first that comes to mind from a European context? Do you know whether it was known or it had impact on these writers, for instance, Hayashi Fumiko?
Well, thank you for your question. This is something that I wanted to find out myself, because when I started to work on this, I thought, well, I want to check when A Room of One's Own was translated into Japanese. Now, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly the first appearance, but it was much later than the period in which Hayashi Fumiko was writing. So I checked through her biography, but I couldn't find any direct reference to her work. So I cannot say whether she knew Virginia Woolf or not, but you know, there are similarities, even though the air probably the atmosphere she perceived when she traveled abroad in Paris probably contributed to, you know, foster this desire and this sense of the necessity of having a place where to write. So, but it would be another chapter to see how it was translated Virginia Woolf in Japanese for the next.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating, this like connection that may be direct or indirect. We don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry, it's for Namigata Sensei. Shall I ask it or write it? And okay, there seems to be some translation. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for the chat message.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead for the asking question.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Nagisawa Sensei, for sharing and also for your presentation, which was so interesting. I'm really interested in exoticism in Japanese literature. And I was wondering about this link between exoticism and primitivism. And you talked mostly, I feel, about primitivism, and also we could add also this triad of regionalism, the region as more primitive than the capital. I feel that mostly what you talked about today in the 1930s with this lost home idea is mostly about primitivism, maybe more than exoticism. I don't know if you agree with that. So I would like to know your opinion about that, and whether this idea of primitivism is linked or not with the rising nationalism and the militarism at the time. Like the writers who use this primitivism, did they see it as a kind of resistance against a modernity gone too far, like a technology gone too far through the military and through this the World War that was in preparation? Or is it on the contrary something that could fit within nationalism, about fighting savagery, but also defending one's land and one's honor? I wonder which way it goes politically. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Isabel. The primitivism is of course related to the nationalism sometimes. And in the nationalism field, the primitive means the past, long past, far past, to deny the modernization and westernization. This is very orthodox way of thinking of modernism, represented by Kawabata and Yokomitsu. Yokomitsu and Kawabata is a very representative modernism, but not only modernism but also nationalism. But I have been thinking about Japanese modernism as a broader context. But as I introduced today, new modernists also seek for another primitivism in the colony. So I'd like to see the two way of primitivism in the 19th century, 1930s literature. When we think about from the perspective of primitive, we can find some new thinking. Just I'm trying to, but the primitive is very easily related to nationalism. Yeah, this is very true. But in that cases, modernism ends to the nationalism. This is not the only answer I'm thinking about it. And the new modernists seeking for the colony as a primitive, of course, they failed to save the colony. but of course they are failure, one of the Japanese modernists, but Yokomitsu cannot continue his work before because of his death just after the war. And Kawabata, I think he tries to avoid the activity in the wartime. And in contrast to them, Hayashi Fumiko write about the wartime experience based on her experience in her novel. And Abe Tomoji also writes his novel based on his experience of wartime activity. What is the difference, the old modernist and the new modernist? I'm thinking about it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, maybe if nobody else has something to say, I would just wanted to add that, yeah, I think that all the papers were really, really interesting, focusing on very important aspects of literature in those years. But I can't help thinking also that there are many interesting ramifications that can make us also, that can help us also rethink some of more contemporary instances. So for example, regarding Marco's presentation, I couldn't help but think that if on the one hand, as you very eloquently explained, then the writing of the studio space is also an acknowledgement or coming into awareness of also a woman's literary status. I can't help but think also related to the fact that, as you mentioned, there were interviews of authors that gave a glimpse to the audience into their own life, how things are now with writers, but also other celebrities. Because correct me if I'm wrong, my feeling nowadays is that personalities, even that have good high literary status, be they men or women, are moving away from the private space. So I hardly, I mean, the first image that comes to my mind of a living author in his studio is Oe Kenzaburo, for example, or something else like that. But I can't help but feel that somehow we are moving away from the author as a literary persona. This is where I work, this is my space, this is how I use my tools. Whereas if we can compare those articles to modern day social media, I feel that we're moving away from the private space of these authors, and the world is generally more interested in what they have to say about anything else than literature. This is my feeling. So I can't help but think that there are so many interesting ramifications in what you're doing, also diachronically speaking, if this is relevant or not. So it's more of a comment than a question. But
thank you, Filippo. It reminds me that I read it's probably in his one of his latest work that Murakami Haruki is talking about his writing space, and he says that he has no studio. Basically, the studio is wherever he puts his computer and he writes. So, but what is important to him is the process, a process that will never be acknowledged by the readers, because they don't see what happens behind the screen of the computer. So this is just something that I was thinking about while you were sharing your comment. But yeah, I think you're right. Probably that was more how can I say, something that was perceived as important in the modern era than nowadays, where everything is more probably fluid. Even the author, the writer, is not like the perceived as it was at the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, sorry.
And also when you read that bit about Hayashi Fumiko, what she does in the studio, I mean, it's probably the longest stretch possible, but I couldn't help but think of that letter by Machiavelli to his friend when he's in exile, that he's saying that, oh, during the day I play dice with people in the tavern, but then when I go home and I have all my books and I put on the toga and I dialogue with people. So I don't know, I think it would be, I don't know, like tracing a history of how the studio is treated literarily could be the topic of a whole book, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I would love to read it.
And also as a place where tourists there is involves also the literary tourism somehow, because people want to see where writers used to write. I was surprised that when I visit Tokyo last time to see the new museum they dedicated to Soseki, and the only place they've reconstructed within this museum, it's the studio space with all these books and stores.
Thank you.
If I might, I add on that, because there's no other question and it's very interesting. It shows this idea that the studio is not entirely private, is it? It's already public, right? And it belongs to the public more than actually the writer. And from the moment it's mediatized and publicized, either by the writer themselves writing about it, or you mentioned all these very funny articles just publicizing the private life of the authors in the media in Japan at the time, like what they have for breakfast and stuff like that. The writer is not public anymore, right? Once he or she is a writer in the public eye. So the studio really belongs to the readers, actually, in a way.
Yeah, it's kind of
collectivization of space.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Is there any thought or comment that you like to do? Put a microphone on, and then if you want to talk, somebody. If not, I think we can wrap up a little bit earlier. Is anybody final call? Okay. So thank you very much for all the presenters. It was really fantastic presentations. And then which paper really talk each other. And then we learned a lot through this as well. And thank you very much for all the participants who comment and ask questions. We really enjoyed the time here. And though virtually, I really appreciate your continuous contribution and participation for EAJS. Filippo, would you like to say something?
Well, of course, I just want to, I concur with everything you said. And also I wanted to also express that I was really pleased with how the papers came together in this panel, because as you know, when we have to put together the panels with individual papers, we can only base ourselves on abstracts that in this case were written sometimes like over two years ago and so you have an idea of the period, you have an idea of the theme, but of course listening to the whole presentation is a completely different matter. So I myself, when I'm in these sessions, sometimes I'm wondering, okay, let's see how things turn out. And I would just want to say that I'm really pleased with how things turned out with this paper. I'm sure Nozomi agrees with me. So thank you all for your wonderful work.